When federal agents finally broke through the reinforced steel door in the basement of the Russo estate in March of 1947, the smell hit them first. A nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting meat, and something else, something ancient and wrong that made even the most hardened investigators gag and stumble backward into the New Jersey rain. What they found cowering in the corner of that concrete tomb would haunt every man present for the rest of their lives. The creature, and that's what they called it in their sealed reports, not a man, but a creature, had translucent skin stretched tight over protruding bones, fingernails grown into yellowed talons nearly 4 inches long, and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. When it opened its mouth, no words came out, only a wet, guttural sound that belonged to no human language. The official report listed the body in the bunker as unidentified vagrant, deceased from natural causes. But 3 of the agents who entered that room resigned within a month. 2 more requested immediate transfers. And the lead investigator, a 20-year veteran of organized crime cases named Marcus Devlin, drank himself to death within 3 years, muttering the same phrase over and over in his final days. The Don's brother was still alive down there. God help us, he was still alive. But how does a man become a monster? How does blood betray blood so completely that one brother can condemn another to 12 years of absolute darkness, 12 years of isolation so complete that the mind fractures and the body adapts in ways that shouldn't be possible? The answer lies in the twisted code of honor that ruled the Italian-American crime families of the 1930s, in the poisonous shame that clung to anything deemed weak or different, and in the monstrous ego of one man who valued his reputation more than his own flesh and blood. This is the story of Vittorio Russo, the most feared Don in northern New Jersey, a man who built an empire on blood and fear, who commanded the loyalty of 300 soldiers and controlled everything from the waterfront to the state legislature. This is the story of Silas Russo, born with snow-white hair and pink eyes in an era when such differences were seen as curses, a mathematical genius whose mind could have changed the world, but instead was buried alive by his own brother. And this is the story of what happens when shame turns to cruelty, when cruelty becomes torture, and when a human being is pushed so far beyond the boundaries of sanity that something new, something terrifying, emerges from the darkness. To understand how it came to this, how a brother could become a jailer, how a man could become a myth whispered about in the darkest corners of the underworld, we must go back to a frigid February night in 1935, to a brownstone in Newark, where the Russo family gathered for what should have been a celebration, and instead became the night that sealed Silas's fate forever. The Russo family mansion sat on a hill overlooking the Passaic River, a 3-story monument to new money, wrapped in old-world tradition. Every surface gleamed, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers imported from Venice, mahogany furniture that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. But on this particular February evening in 1935, as ice formed patterns on the windows and snow buried the manicured gardens, the opulence felt suffocating, heavy with expectation and unspoken judgment. Vittorio Russo stood at the head of the dining table, his thick frame draped in a tailored suit that cost $600, his dark hair slicked back with pomade that smelled of bergamot and violence. At 32 years old, he had already made a name for himself as one of the most ruthless and efficient operators in the Genovese organization. His territory stretched from Hoboken to Patterson, a fiefdom of speakeasies, gambling dens, and protection rackets that generated over $50,000 a month. Men crossed the street when they saw him coming. Cops took his money and looked the other way. Rival families spoke his name in whispers, if they spoke it at all. But tonight, his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth, and a vein pulsed at his temple like a countdown to explosion. Because sitting at the far end of the table, head bowed over a plate of untouched pasta, was the one thing that threatened everything Vittorio had built: his younger brother, Silas. Silas was 24 years old, slight and angular, where Vittorio was broad and powerful. But it wasn't his build that drew stares. It was his appearance. Hair the color of fresh snow, eyebrows and lashes so pale they were nearly invisible, and eyes that appeared pink in certain lights, though they were actually a very pale blue, with red blood vessels visible through the iris. In an era when Italian-American families prized dark Mediterranean features as badges of ethnic pride, Silas's albinism was seen as something shameful, a genetic aberration that invited questions and superstitions. The family doctor, old Dr. Calabrese, with his thick accent and thicker superstitions, had whispered to Vittorio's father years ago that albinism was God's punishment for some hidden sin, that such children were touched by il malocchio, the evil eye. And while Vittorio knew better intellectually, knew that Silas's condition was simply a quirk of biology, the shame ran deeper than logic. Every time he looked at his brother, he saw a weakness, a crack in the Russo reputation that rival families could exploit. Silas! Vittorio's voice cut through the awkward silence around the table. His mother, Francesca, stopped eating. His wife, Angela, studied her wineglass with sudden fascination. "I asked you a question. Are you going to answer, or are you going to sit there like a ghost?" Silas lifted his head slowly. His eyes, those pale, unsettling eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things, met Vittorio's gaze without flinching. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, edged with intelligence that made some men uncomfortable. "I said I'm not interested in being on display at your meeting tomorrow. You want to parade your power in front of the other families? That's your business. But don't pretend you want me there for any reason other than obligation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Francesca made a small sound, something between a gasp and a prayer. Angela's hand tightened around her wineglass until her knuckles went white. Vittorio set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Display?" The word dripped with barely controlled rage. "You think that's what this is about? The Genovese family is coming to discuss our expansion into Elizabeth. Do you understand what that means? They're acknowledging our power, our legitimacy. And you, my blood, my brother, can't be bothered to sit in a room for 2 hours and keep your mouth shut." "What I understand," Silas replied, his voice maddeningly calm, "is that you're ashamed of me. You've been ashamed of me since we were children. You think I don't see the way you position me at gatherings, always in the back, always in shadows. You think I don't hear the things men say when they think I can't understand Italian. Spettro, fantasma, il maledetto, the ghost, the cursed one." Vittorio's hand slammed on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. "You will show respect in this house. I show respect to those who earn it." The slap came so fast that Francesca didn't have time to cry out. One moment Silas was speaking, the next he was sprawled on the floor, blood trickling from his split lip, staining his pale skin like red ink on parchment. Vittorio stood over him, chest heaving, his right hand still raised. "You want to know about respect? About shame? Every time you walk into a room, men question my judgment. They wonder if the Russo blood is weak. They wonder if I'm weak for protecting you." He grabbed Silas by the collar, hauling him to his feet with frightening strength. "You are a liability, a ghost that haunts my success." Silas wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. When he spoke, there was something new in his voice. Not fear, but a cold understanding, a recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding. "Then why don't you do something about it, Vittorio? Why don't you put me out of your misery?" The words hung in the air like a dare, like a prophecy. Vittorio released his grip, and Silas stumbled backward. For a long moment, the two brothers stared at each other, one tall and powerful, carved from violence and ambition, the other slight and otherworldly, his mind sharp as a blade, but his body a constant reminder of difference. "Get out of my sight," Vittorio finally said, his voice now terrifyingly quiet. "Go to your room. We'll discuss your future in the morning." Silas turned without another word and walked out of the dining room. His footsteps echoed up the marble staircase, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. What none of them knew, not Francesca with her rosary clutched tight in her lap, not Angela, who was already planning her excuse to leave early in the morning, and certainly not Silas as he sat alone in his room, touching his split lip and staring out at the frozen river, was that Vittorio Russo had already made his decision. The future he mentioned wasn't a future at all. It was an ending. And in the basement of the estate, behind the wine cellar where the family stored their most expensive bottles, there was a room. A reinforced concrete bunker built during Prohibition to hide shipments of illegal liquor. with walls 2 feet thick and a steel door that could withstand a battering ram. It was soundproof, lightless when the door was closed, and large enough to hold a man. Large enough to bury him alive. The next morning broke cold and gray over Newark. Silas woke to the sound of footsteps outside his door. Not the light step of the housemaid bringing breakfast, but heavy boots, multiple pairs, moving with purpose. He sat up in bed, his pale fingers instinctively reaching for the small notebook on his nightstand where he'd been working on a complex probability equation, as if numbers could protect him from whatever was coming. The door burst open. 3 men entered, and Silas recognized them immediately. Giuseppe Big Joe Marchetti, Vittorio's most trusted enforcer, a mountain of muscle who'd reportedly killed his first man at 16. Sal Benedetto, thinner but no less dangerous, with eyes like chips of black ice. And Marco Russo, their cousin, who'd always looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Your brother wants to see you," Big Joe said, his voice surprisingly soft for a man his size. "Get dressed. We're going downstairs." Silas didn't move. "Downstairs? Why not his office?" "Don't make this difficult, Silas." Marco stepped forward, and there was genuine regret in his expression. "Please, just come with us." Something primal stirred in Silas's chest, an animal awareness of danger that transcended logic. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to scream for help. But where would he run? This was Vittorio's domain. Every person in this house, every man on the grounds, answered to his brother first. He pulled on a shirt and trousers, with hands that trembled only slightly, then followed the 3 men out of his room and down the hallway. They didn't go to the main staircase. Instead, they walked to the servants' stairs at the back of the house, narrow and worn, leading down into the kitchen and then further down, into the basement. The smell hit him first. Damp concrete, mildew, and underneath it all, the sweet sour scent of old wine. The basement was enormous, a maze of storage rooms and mechanical spaces that stretched beneath the entire footprint of the house. Bare bulbs hung from the ceiling every 20 feet, casting pools of weak yellow light separated by stretches of shadow. They walked past the furnace room, its massive iron bulk silent now in the February cold. Past shelves stacked with canned goods and dry stores. Past the wine cellar with its rows of dusty bottles. And then they stopped in front of a door Silas had never noticed before, hidden in an alcove behind a tall metal shelving unit that Big Joe and Marco pushed aside with surprising ease. The door was steel, painted the same gray as the concrete walls, with a handle like you'd find on a bank vault. Vittorio stood before it, dressed in a black suit that made him look like an executioner. His face was carefully blank, revealing nothing. "Silas," he gestured to the door. "Come here." Silas didn't move. "What is this?" "Come, here." Not a request, a command. Every fiber of Silas's being screamed resistance, but Big Joe's massive hand clamped onto his shoulder, fingers digging into bone, and propelled him forward until he stood directly in front of his brother. Vittorio studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes moving across Silas's pale features like a man examining a stranger. "You said something last night that I can't stop thinking about. You asked me why I don't put you out of my misery." He reached out and gripped Silas's chin, forcing eye contact. "The problem is, Silas, that killing you would create questions. Your disappearance would need explanation. Bodies create investigations." Ice flooded Silas's veins. "Vittorio, whatever you're thinking, but if you simply go away, if you leave in the night, maybe run off to California or Europe like so many restless young men do. If you're gone but not dead, then there's no crime. Just a family disappointment who couldn't handle the weight of the Russo name." "You can't." Silas tried to pull away, but Big Joe's grip tightened until he gasped in pain. Vittorio turned and pulled the heavy door open. Beyond it was darkness, absolute suffocating darkness. The smell that wafted out was stale air and concrete and something else. Something that promised eternity in the worst possible way. "This room was built to hide things," Vittorio said softly. "Liquor during Prohibition, bodies when necessary, and now it will hide you." Silas's mind raced, searching desperately for the right words, the argument that would reach whatever humanity remained in his brother. "You don't have to do this. I'll leave. I'll go to California like you said. You'll never see me again, I swear it. You'll be out by fall, Vittorio interrupted, and for just a moment, something that might have been guilt flickered across his face. I promise you that. By fall, things will have settled. The families will have forgotten about you. And then I'll move you somewhere quiet, somewhere you can live out your life in peace. 6 months, Silas. That's all. It was a lie. Silas knew it was a lie the moment the words left Vittorio's mouth, knew it in the desperate way his brother couldn't quite meet his eyes, in the way Big Joe's grip gentled almost imperceptibly, as if even the enforcer didn't quite believe what was about to happen. Please, Silas whispered, and he hated the sound of his own voice, hated the desperation that cracked through it like ice breaking on the river. Please don't do this. I'm your brother. We shared a room when we were children. I'm your blood, Vittorio. Your blood. For one suspended moment, the world held its breath. Something moved behind Vittorio's eyes, memory perhaps, or the ghost of love that existed before shame poisoned it. Then it was gone, shuttered behind the cold mask of a man who had murdered his own compassion years ago. Take him inside. Big Joe and Marco grabbed Silas by the arms. He fought then, fought with every ounce of strength his slight frame possessed, twisting and kicking and screaming. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, bouncing through the labyrinthine basement, but no one came. The servants knew better than to investigate screams in the Russo house. Francesca was upstairs with her rosary, praying to saints who didn't answer. Angela had already left for her mother's house, as Vittorio had known she would. They dragged him through the doorway into absolute darkness. Silas's feet scraped against concrete as he tried to find purchase, tried to anchor himself to anything. But there was nothing to grab, nothing to hold on to except the arms of the men who were burying him alive. They threw him forward. He landed hard on the concrete floor, pain exploding through his shoulder and hip. Footsteps retreated, and then, before Silas could scramble to his feet, the door swung closed with a sound like a tomb sealing. The lock engaged, thick metal sliding into metal, tumblers falling into place with terrible finality. And the darkness was complete. Not the darkness of a room at night where your eyes eventually adjust, where shapes emerge from shadow. This was the darkness of the earth, of the void, of spaces where light had never existed and never would. Silas's scream tore from his throat, raw and primal, smashing against concrete walls that swallowed the sound and gave nothing back. He lunged forward, hands slamming against where he remembered the door being, fingers scrabbling for a handle that didn't exist on this side. His nails scraped against steel until they bent backward and blood made his palms slick. Vittorio! His voice was already going hoarse. Vittorio, please! I'm sorry! Whatever I did! I'm sorry! But there was no answer. Just the sound of footsteps above, fading away. Just the sound of his own ragged breathing. Just the darkness pressing in like a living thing, like water filling his lungs. Silas collapsed against the door, his body racked with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief, from the place where hope breaks and dies. He didn't know it yet, couldn't know it in that moment of absolute despair. But his brother had lied about more than just the duration of his imprisonment. The room he sat in was 15 feet square, made of reinforced concrete with no windows, and a ventilation shaft so small that even if Silas could reach the ceiling, he'd never fit through it. There was a bucket in one corner for waste, a thin mattress that smelled of mildew, a jug of water that would be refilled once a day through a small slot at the bottom of the door, and once a day a tray of food, always cold, always minimal, always passed through without a word. Vittorio had said 6 months, but 6 months became a year, and a year became 2, and 2 became 5, then 8, then 10. The seasons changed in the world above. Snow gave way to spring, spring to scorching summer, summer to the bright agony of fall. But in the bunker, there was only darkness, only silence broken by the sound of a tray sliding through a slot, only the slow, inexorable breaking of a human mind under the weight of absolute isolation. And in that darkness, something changed, something adapted, something evolved in ways that the human animal was never meant to evolve. in response to conditions that would have killed anyone else within months. The creature that would eventually be discovered 12 years later was already beginning to form, cell by cell, thought by thought, scream by silent scream. But that transformation was still years away. First, Silas had to survive the breaking. He had to endure the moment when his mind shattered like glass, and he had to choose which pieces to pick up, which fragments of himself to keep, and which to leave behind in the darkness. That moment came on day 47, when Silas finally understood that no one was coming to save him, that his brother's promise was ash, that he was going to die in this concrete tomb, forgotten by everyone except the man who put him there. And on day 48, when he stopped screaming and started counting instead, marking time by scratching lines into the concrete wall with a piece of the metal tray that he'd bent and sharpened against the floor, that's when the real nightmare began. The first year was madness, not the instant insanity of a mind snapping under pressure, but a slow drowning in an ocean of isolation. Silas talked to himself constantly, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there, arguing with phantoms. He recited everything he could remember: poetry from school, passages from books, mathematical theorems, the names of streets in Newark, the prayers his mother taught him before shame made her avoid his eyes. He exercised obsessively, running his hands along the walls of his 15-foot prison until he'd mapped every inch, every irregularity in the concrete, creating a geography of nothing. He did push-ups until his arms trembled and gave out, sit-ups until his stomach cramped. Anything to feel his body, to prove he still existed in some form other than a mind screaming in the void. The food came once a day through the slot at the bottom of the door, always cold pasta or bread, sometimes a piece of fruit that was already browning, occasionally a thin soup that tasted of nothing. And once a day, the water jug was refilled, pulled out and pushed back through the narrow opening without a word. Silas tried to speak to whoever delivered the food, but they never answered. Eventually, he stopped trying. Time became meaningless. Without the sun or moon, without the rhythm of day and night, Silas's body rebelled against normal sleep patterns. He would be awake for what felt like 30 hours, then sleep for 12, then wake and sleep in random intervals that bore no relationship to the world above. He marked the walls obsessively, one scratch for every meal. But even that became confused when exhaustion made him unsure if he'd already marked a day or not. The darkness did things to his eyes. At first, he saw afterimages, phantoms of light that his brain created desperately trying to fill the void. Then those false lights evolved into shapes, geometric patterns that danced across the blackness, faces that formed and dissolved, entire scenes that played out like films projected onto the back of his eyelids. His mind, starved for visual input, began to cannibalize itself, feeding on memories and imagination until he couldn't tell the difference. He had conversations with his mother, long detailed arguments about her cooking, her faith, the way she used to braid his hair when he was small before she realized what his pale coloring meant for the family's reputation. She sat in the corner of his cell. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there, and told him stories about Italy, about the village where she'd grown up, about saints and miracles and the way olive trees looked silver in the moonlight. He played chess with his father, who died when Silas was 16. The old man was disappointed in him, always had been, and even now in this phantom conversation he criticized Silas's moves, his lack of strategy, his fundamental weakness. "This is why Vittorio is the strong one," Ghost Father said. "This is why he leads, and you follow." "I'm not following him now," Silas whispered into the darkness. "I'm buried. There's a difference." The ghost didn't argue with that. Sometime in the second year, or what Silas calculated was the second year based on his wall scratches, though he was no longer certain, his eyes began to change. The darkness had become so complete, so total, that his pupils remained permanently dilated, stretched wide in a desperate attempt to catch light that didn't exist. The blood vessels in his eyes, always slightly visible due to his albinism, became more pronounced, creating a spiderweb of red across the pale blue iris. When food came through the slot, the thin strip of light from the hallway beyond, barely a crack, gone in seconds, became agony. Silas learned to shield his eyes, to turn away, to wait until the slot closed before he crawled forward to retrieve the tray. Even that momentary exposure left him with stabbing headaches that lasted for hours. His skin changed too. Already pale from albinism, it now took on a translucent quality from total absence of sunlight. In the rare moments when light did penetrate his prison, when the food slot opened, or when he held his hand directly before his face and imagined he could see it, his skin looked almost see-through, blue veins mapping rivers beneath the surface. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what was happening in his mind. The Silas who had entered this tomb, educated, logical, with a mathematical mind that could calculate complex probabilities in seconds, was dying. In his place, something else was being born. Something that thought differently, perceived differently, existed on a plane where normal human reasoning no longer applied. He started to understand the darkness, not as an absence of light, but as a presence unto itself. It had texture, weight, mood. Some days it pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. Other days it felt almost welcoming, a blanket that protected him from the cruelty of the world above. He learned to navigate his cell without touching the walls, feeling the space through some sixth sense that had nothing to do with sight. He could hear things no human should hear, the water pipes running through the walls, a constant whisper of liquid through metal, the vibrations of footsteps 2 floors above, each person's gait distinct, the heavy tread of Big Joe, the quick, precise steps of his brother, the hesitant shuffle of the housemaid who probably didn't even know he existed, the sound of the furnace cycling on and off, the expansion and contraction of the building itself as seasons changed, and voices, even through 2 feet of concrete, through the steel door, through the labyrinth of basement rooms. He could sometimes hear voices, muffled, distorted, but there. His brother conducting business, men laughing, once a woman crying, and once screaming followed by a gunshot so distinct that Silas knew exactly which room it came from, knew that someone had been executed in the wine cellar, their body probably wrapped in canvas and loaded into a car trunk before dawn. By the 3rd year, Silas had stopped trying to maintain his humanity in any conventional sense. He no longer exercised. He no longer recited poetry. He sat in the darkness and listened to the building breathe. He ate when food came and ignored it when it didn't. His body had adapted to minimal nutrition, burning through what little muscle remained until he was skeletal, all angles and protruding bones. His hair grew long, past his shoulders, a tangle of white that he never saw but could feel when he ran his fingers through it. His nails grew too, curving and yellowing in the darkness, becoming something other than human nails. He tried to file them against the concrete walls, but eventually gave up. What did it matter? Who would see them? Who would care? It was in the 3rd year that he started to plan. Not escape. Escape was impossible. He'd accepted that within the first 6 months, but something else. Something darker. If he was going to die in this tomb, if his brother had condemned him to this slow erosion of self, then he would make sure that death had meaning. He would make sure that when they eventually found his body, because they would find it someday, even if it took decades, it would tell a story. It would be an accusation written in bone and stone. He began scratching on the walls with systematic precision. Not just marks for days past, but words, names, dates. The truth of what Vittorio had done. He carved it into the concrete with the sharpened edge of his metal food tray, letter by letter, line by line, working in absolute darkness by memory and touch alone. His fingers bled. The sharpened metal wore down and he sharpened it again. The words took shape slowly, like fossils forming in rock. Vittorio Russo buried his brother alive. February 1935. My name is Silas Russo and I did not want to die. Simple words. True words. Words that would outlast both brothers, that would remain long after their bodies turned to dust, as long as the concrete stood. And as he carved, as his fingers traced the letters over and over in the darkness until he could recite them perfectly, until they were etched as deeply in his mind as in the stone, something shifted. The madness that had been threatening to consume him completely, the voices, the visions, the slow dissolution of self, began to crystallize into something else. Purpose. He would survive. Not because he wanted to, Not because life in this tomb held any joy or meaning, but because survival itself was the ultimate revenge. Every day he drew breath was a day his brother's crime continued. Every year that passed was another year of guilt that Vittorio would carry, another year of looking over his shoulder, wondering if somehow, impossibly, the secret would emerge. And so Silas adapted. His body changed in ways that shouldn't be possible. Bones becoming hollow and light, muscles atrophying to nothing, his nervous system rewiring itself to function in total darkness. His mind changed too, discarding everything unnecessary for survival, keeping only the sharp edge of intelligence and the burning coal of rage that refused to die. By the 4th year, he had stopped being entirely human, not in the dramatic way of legends or horror stories, but in small, terrible increments. He no longer dreamed of the sun. He no longer remembered the taste of real food, only the cold paste that came through the slot. He no longer thought in full sentences, only in fragments and images and the endless loop of his revenge fantasy. He waited and listened and planned, because Vittorio had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that isolation would break his brother, that darkness would destroy him. That time would reduce Silas to nothing more than a breathing corpse, ready to die quietly and be buried deeper still, forgotten forever. But Vittorio had forgotten something about the Russo blood that ran through both their veins. It was survivor's blood. It was the blood of men who had crossed an ocean with nothing, who had built empires from scraps, who had taken everything they wanted and let God sort out the morality later. And Silas, pale and strange and locked in darkness, was every bit as much a Russo as his brother. The question was no longer if he would survive. The question was what would be left of him when the door finally opened. What comes out of 12 years of absolute darkness? What remains of a man after his humanity has been systematically stripped away, piece by piece, until only the burning core remains. The federal agents who would eventually break through that door had no idea what they were about to face. Neither did Vittorio, who had convinced himself that his brother was surely dead by now, that the problem had solved itself through neglect and time. But in the bunker, in the absolute darkness, the thing that had once been Silas Russo was very much alive. And it was counting the days, scratch by scratch on the concrete wall, waiting for the moment when the lock would fail, or the door would open, or the building would burn down, or whatever crack in Vittorio's security would finally come. It had been 4 years. It would be 8 more. And with every day that passed, every meal delivered in silence, every moment of sensory deprivation that should have killed him but didn't, the transformation continued. The 5th year brought a visitor. Not to the bunker. Vittorio had been very clear that no one but himself and Big Joe were to know about Silas's existence, but to the house above. A distant cousin from Sicily, arriving in America with dreams of joining the family business, and a dangerous habit of asking questions. Silas heard him 3 days before the man died. The acoustics of his tomb had become his world. Through the concrete, through the floor and ceiling, through the pipes and walls, sound traveled in waves that Silas had learned to read like a blind man reads Braille. He could distinguish between the furnace cycling and footsteps in the hallway above, between rain hammering on windows 2 floors up and the rhythmic drip of a leaking pipe in the wine cellar. His hearing had become supernatural, compensating for the absolute loss of sight, developing to levels that would have been impossible if he'd retained normal vision. The new voice was young, eager, and far too curious. Silas couldn't make out words. The sound was too muffled, too distorted. But he could hear the tonal patterns. Questions. Lots of questions. And something else. Something in the rhythm of feet above that suggested exploration. The young cousin was wandering the house, opening doors, investigating rooms that had been closed for years. On the 3rd day, Silas heard the footsteps enter the basement. His body, so accustomed to absolute stillness that even the slightest movement felt like violence, tensed. The footsteps moved through the maze of storage rooms, getting closer to the wine cellar, to the alcove behind the shelves, to the door that no one was supposed to find. Silas crawled to the steel barrier that separated him from the world. He pressed his palms against the cold metal, feeling the vibrations as someone approached. His mouth, which hadn't formed words in months, tried to remember how speech worked, and then, A miracle. A thin beam of light appeared at the bottom of the door, the food slot sliding open. But this time, there was a face. Silas could see it, just a vague shape through the narrow opening, backlit by the weak bulb in the hallway beyond. The face of a young man, perhaps 20 years old, eyes widening in horror as he peered into the darkness and saw something pale moving in the shadows. "Madonna Santa," the words were barely a whisper. "There's someone in there." Silas tried to speak. His throat produced a sound somewhere between a word and an animal's groan, a wet rasp that had nothing to do with human language. The face jerked back from the slot in terror. "Don't!" Silas managed, forcing the word through a throat that had forgotten how to form consonants. "Help!" But the face was gone. Footsteps retreated rapidly, and Silas heard something else. Shouting. Confused voices. The cousin calling for Vittorio, saying something about a prisoner, about someone locked in the basement. Then the footsteps returned. Multiple pairs. Heavy, purposeful. The cousin's voice, still young, still eager, still thinking he was about to uncover some vital secret that would earn him respect in the family. "Uncle Vittorio, there's a man locked behind that door. I saw him. Someone thin, pale." "Who is he?" Silence. A silence so heavy with danger that even through 2 floors and 2 feet of concrete, Silas could feel its weight. Vittorio's voice, when it came, was soft. Too soft. "You saw nothing." "But I did, I swear there's—" The gunshot sounded like thunder in the confined space of the basement. The cousin's body hit the floor with a wet thud. Silas, pressed against the door, felt the vibrations through the steel, felt the final spasms of a dying man just feet away on the other side of the barrier that separated life from living death. Big Joe's voice. "What do you want me to do with him?" "Take him to the river. Weight him down properly this time." A pause. "And Giuseppe, nail that food slot shut. From now on, we use the ceiling grate." "Boss, the ceiling grate is only 6 inches wide. We can barely fit a cup through there, let alone—" "I said use the ceiling grate. He gets water and bread. Nothing more." "Boss, he'll starve." "He should have starved years ago. The fact that he's still breathing is more than he deserves." And then the footsteps retreated. Big Joe dragging the cousin's body across the concrete floor, leaving a wet trail that Silas could smell through the slot before it was sealed forever. Blood and bowel, and the copper-sweet scent of death. The food slot was hammered shut within the hour, metal scraping against metal, nails driven into the frame with methodical precision. And from that day forward, Silas's already minimal contact with the outside world was reduced to almost nothing. Once a day, he would hear a faint scraping sound above his head, the grate in the ceiling being opened, too small to fit anything larger than his fist. A bottle of water would be lowered on a rope. Sometimes a piece of hard bread wrapped in paper. No fresh food, no vegetables or fruit. Nothing that required a plate or utensils. His body, already skeletal, began to truly waste away. His teeth loosened from malnutrition. His bones became so brittle that when he accidentally fell in the darkness, his wrist fractured and healed incorrectly, leaving his hand twisted at an odd angle. But his mind, that was the terrible miracle. His mind didn't decay. It sharpened. It focused down to a single point of burning awareness. He could no longer remember what his mother looked like, couldn't recall the layout of the house beyond his prison, had forgotten the smell of fresh air and the feeling of wind on his skin. But he remembered his brother's voice, every inflection, every subtle threat. And he remembered the sound of a young man dying because he'd seen too much, because he dared to ask questions about something that was supposed to remain hidden forever. The cousin's ghost joined the others that haunted Silas's darkness. But this one was different. This one was proof that Vittorio would kill anyone to keep his secret, that there was no line he wouldn't cross, no murder too brutal if it served his purposes. And Silas, lying in the darkness with his broken wrist throbbing and his empty stomach cramping around nothing, understood with perfect clarity that his brother would never let him out. The promise of 6 months had been a lie. The door would stay locked until Silas died, and even then his body would probably remain in this tomb, slowly decomposing, bones eventually scattering across the concrete floor like dice, unless something changed. unless the world above shifted in some fundamental way that forced the door open despite Vittorio's paranoia. And so Silas waited, not with hope. Hope had died years ago, but with the patience of stone, of water wearing away rock, of inevitability itself. The 6th year passed, then the 7th. His hair grew until it covered his back, a tangled mat of white that was home to lice and filth. His nails continued to grow, curving over themselves like the claws of something that had never been human. His skin was paper-thin now, translucent in a way that went beyond albinism, stretched over bones that jutted at sharp angles. He could feel his heart beating irregularly, skipping beats, struggling to pump blood through a body that was slowly shutting down. Sometimes he would wake, though wake wasn't quite the right word anymore since the line between consciousness and unconsciousness had blurred to nothing, and be unsure if he was still alive or if this darkness was what came after death. But the anger kept him going. The rage that burned in his chest, oxygen for a fire that refused to die. Every scratch on the wall was a curse. Every breath was an accusation. Every day of survival was a middle finger raised to the brother who had tried to erase him. By the 8th year, Silas had lost the ability to speak entirely. The muscles in his throat had atrophied from disuse. His tongue felt thick and useless. When he tried to form words, only guttural sounds emerged, groans, clicks, wet gasping noises that belonged to something dredged from the bottom of the ocean. But he could still think, and he could still hate. The 9th and 10th years blurred together into one long nightmare of semi-consciousness, punctuated by moments of sharp awareness when the water bottle was lowered, or when vibrations from above suggested something significant was happening in the house. Once, there was an argument. He couldn't hear the words, but the emotional pitch was unmistakable. Vittorio's wife, Angela, screaming at him about something, her voice shrill with fear or disgust. Then a slap. Then silence. Once there was music, a party of some kind, 2 floors above, jazz filtering down through concrete and wood and steel until it reached Silas's tomb as a ghostly rhythm, proof that life continued in the world he'd been erased from. Once, there were sirens, police arriving at the estate for some reason, boots on marble floors, voices demanding answers. Silas tried to make noise, tried to alert them, but his throat only produced a dry clicking sound that couldn't penetrate the steel door. The police left. The building settled back into its normal rhythms, and Silas understood that even if they'd heard him, even if someone had investigated the strange sound from the basement, Vittorio would have explained it away. Rats, pipes, the building settling. Whatever lie came easily to a man who'd perfected deception. By the 11th year, Silas was no longer certain if he was still human or if he'd become something else. He'd started eating the spiders that occasionally fell through the ceiling grate along with his bread. He'd learned to lap water from the bottle like an animal, his broken wrist unable to grip properly, his fingers too weak to support the weight. He marked time now only by the growth of his hair, cutting it occasionally with the edge of his metal tray that had been sharpened to a razor's edge over years of grinding against concrete. The hair he cut, he braided into a rope, a ridiculous project, a madman's task, but it gave him purpose. Inch by inch the rope grew. He had no idea what he would do with it, but the act of creation, of making something in this void of nothing, was the only thing keeping the last fragment of his sanity intact. The 12th year began the way all the others had, in darkness, in silence, in the slow erosion of a body that should have died long ago. But this year was different. This year, the world above began to shift in ways that would eventually crack the foundations of Vittorio's empire. The end, when it came, was not the result of conscience or justice or any kind of moral reckoning. It was the product of simple mathematics, the inevitable collapse that comes when you build an empire on lies and violence. In early 1947, 12 years after Silas was locked away, Vittorio Russo made a critical error. He expanded his territory too aggressively, moving into Jersey City without proper authorization from the Genovese family. It was a breach of protocol, an act of arrogance that suggested Vittorio had forgotten he was part of a larger structure, that he answered to men more powerful than himself. The commission called a meeting. Vittorio was ordered to explain himself, to justify his actions. And in that meeting, surrounded by the other dons who controlled New York and New Jersey, he was told in no uncertain terms that his behavior was unacceptable. Vittorio, whose pride had only grown with his success, made the mistake of arguing, of insisting that he'd earned the right to expand, that his money and his soldiers spoke for themselves. He forgot the cardinal rule of the Mafia. You can have power, but you must always show deference to those above you. The sentence was delivered quietly, almost gently. Vittorio was to step down as Don. His operation would be absorbed into the larger Genovese organization. He would keep his life and a small percentage of his former income. But his empire was over, and to ensure compliance, the commission decided that the Russo estate would be thoroughly inventoried. Every asset would be catalogued, every property seized, every safe opened. It was standard procedure when a Don was deposed, a way of ensuring that no hidden caches of money or weapons remained that could fuel a rebellion. When Vittorio was told about the inventory, about the federal agents who would be going through his home with the explicit blessing of certain corrupt officials on the commission's payroll, he made one final desperate attempt to maintain his secret. He told Big Joe to burn the house down. "Boss, we can't. They'll know it was arson. Then make it look like an accident, a gas leak, something. Boss." Big Joe's voice was pained, the voice of a man who'd followed orders for 20 years, but was finally reaching his limit. "Your mother is still living in that house. Your wife. The servants. Get them out first, then burn it. And the bunker." Silence stretched between them. Vittorio hadn't visited the bunker in 8 years. He'd convinced himself that Silas was long dead, that the problem had resolved itself through neglect. The thought of what might remain in that concrete tomb, a skeleton, or worse, something that was somehow still alive, filled him with a dread so profound he couldn't articulate it. "Seal it," Vittorio finally said. "Before you burn the place, seal that room with concrete. Pour it in through the ceiling grate. Fill the whole damn space. Make sure nothing can ever be found." But Big Joe never got the chance. The very next day, March 3rd, 1947, federal agents arrived at the Russo estate with a warrant and a list of rooms to search. They were efficient, methodical, immune to bribes or threats, because they were operating under the protection of the commission itself. They catalogued the first floor, then the second. Then they descended to the basement with their flashlights and clipboards, mapping out the labyrinthine space, and they found the wine cellar, and the alcove behind the shelves, and the steel door that had no business being there, hidden away like a secret that demanded to be kept. "What's in here?" Agent Marcus Devlin asked the housekeeper, an old woman who'd worked for the Russos for 15 years and had never questioned the locked door she'd been told never to approach. "I don't know, signore. I was told it was storage. Old furniture, maybe." "It's locked." Devlin examined the heavy-duty mechanism, the kind of lock you'd find on a bank vault. Why would storage need this kind of security? The housekeeper didn't answer, but something in her face, a flicker of knowledge she didn't want to acknowledge, made Devlin's instincts come alive. "Get the bolt cutters," he told his partner. "We're opening this." It took 3 men with crowbars and a hydraulic jack nearly an hour to break through the lock. The steel door screamed as it finally gave way, metal warping, bolts shearing. The agent stood back as the door swung open, and that's when the smell hit them. That nauseating cocktail of human waste and decay, and something else. Something fundamentally wrong that made even hardened investigators gag. Devlin shone his flashlight into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Just concrete walls covered in strange markings, scratches that might have been words. An empty bucket in one corner, scraps of cloth that might have once been a mattress. Then something moved in the far corner. Something pale. Something that shouldn't exist. "Jesus Christ," Devlin whispered, and his hand went automatically to his gun. "There's something in there." His partner, Agent Tom Richardson, stepped forward with his own light. The beam caught the thing in the corner, and both men froze. It was humanoid. That was the word Richardson would use later in his report, because his mind refused to accept it as fully human. It was skeletal, bones visible through translucent skin. Hair hung in matted ropes past its waist, colorless and filthy. The hands, if they could be called hands, had nails that had grown into yellowed talons. And the eyes, reflecting light like an animal's, were pink and red and wrong in a way that made Richardson's stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The creature made a sound, a wet, guttural groan that might have been an attempt at communication, or might have been the sound of a mind so broken that language no longer existed. "Sir?" Richardson said, his voice shaking. I think it's alive." Devlin stepped into the room, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. And that's when he saw the scratches weren't random. They were words, hundreds of them, thousands of them, carved into every available surface with desperate precision. Vittorio Russo buried his brother alive. My name is Silas Russo. I did not want to die. February 1935. The words repeated over and over, sometimes legible, sometimes devolving into frantic scratches where the writer's mind or hand had failed. The entire history of 12 years of imprisonment was written on these walls, a testament to suffering so profound that even looking at it felt like a violation. "Get medical," Devlin ordered, his voice tight with something between horror and rage. "And get someone to photograph all of this, every inch of it." But when Richardson tried to approach the creature in the corner, it recoiled with a sound like an animal in pain. It pressed itself against the far wall, those terrible eyes wide and terrified, and Devlin realized with a sinking feeling that whatever this thing had been before, 12 years in this tomb had reduced it to pure instinct. It took 6 hours to coax the creature out of the bunker. Medical personnel arrived with blankets and sedatives, but the thing that had been Silas Russo fought them with surprising strength, born of absolute terror. When they finally managed to sedate it and carry it up into the light of day for the first time in over a decade, the sun caused it such agony that it convulsed and vomited, its body rejecting stimuli it no longer knew how to process. The doctors who examined it, under conditions of absolute secrecy, because the commission had made it very clear that this incident was not to become public knowledge, were baffled by what they found. The subject's eyes had adapted to total darkness, pupils permanently dilated. Its muscles had atrophied to almost nothing. Its bones showed signs of multiple breaks that had healed incorrectly. Vitamin D deficiency, severe malnutrition, psychological trauma beyond anything they had reference for. But the most disturbing finding was the brain scan. The subject's brain had physically changed. The visual cortex had partially shut down. The auditory processing centers had expanded abnormally, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex thought, for personality, for the things that make us human, showed patterns of activity that one neurologist described as frankly terrifying. This person's brain has adapted to sensory deprivation by essentially rewiring itself, the neurologist wrote in his confidential report. The subject may never recover normal human cognition. In many ways, we are looking at a new form of human, or perhaps something that can no longer be classified as human at all. The official story, the one that appeared in sealed government files, listed the subject as John Doe, vagrant, found in abandoned property, deceased shortly after discovery from complications related to prolonged malnutrition. The truth was kept between a handful of agents and the commission itself, who understood immediately what they were looking at: proof of a crime. So heinous that even by their standards, it was unacceptable. Vittorio Russo was called to a meeting. He went willingly, expecting to negotiate his reduced circumstances. Instead, he was taken to a warehouse in Secaucus, where the remaining dons explained what had been found in his basement. "Your brother," Frank Costello said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute authority. 12 years, Vittorio. 12 years you kept your own blood in the ground like an animal. He was a liability. He was your brother. There are rules, lines we don't cross, even in this life. I did what was necessary. What was necessary, Costello interrupted, was to send him away, California, Sicily, give him money and tell him never to come back. What was necessary was not to create a fucking horror show in your basement that could bring attention none of us need. The sentence, when it came, was expected. Vittorio would die. Not dramatically, not publicly. Just a quiet disappearance, a body that would never be found, and a lesson to every other Don that some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Big Joe pulled the trigger himself. It was almost an act of mercy from a man who'd spent 20 years following orders he increasingly questioned. The body was taken to sea and weighted with chains, dropped in water deep enough that it would never rise. And the creature that had been Silas Russo was moved to a private facility upstate, a place where experiments in sensory deprivation were already being conducted for Cold War purposes. The doctors said he might recover, that with years of therapy, proper nutrition, gradual reintroduction to light and sound, something like a human person might emerge. But Silas never spoke again, never wrote again, never showed any sign of recognizing language or responding to human interaction. He lived for 6 more years in that facility, fed through tubes, restrained when he became violent, studied by doctors who saw him as a unique case study in what the human animal could survive and what it couldn't. When he finally died in 1953, the official cause was listed as heart failure. The unofficial truth was that his body simply gave up, having survived far longer than biology suggested was possible. They cremated him. His ashes were scattered in the Atlantic Ocean, the same water that held his brother's remains somewhere far below. And the bunker beneath the Russo estate was filled with concrete, just as Vittorio had wanted, sealing away the scratched words and the terrible history they told. The estate itself was sold, renovated, eventually demolished in the 1970s to make way for a shopping mall. But the story persisted. In the darkest corners of organized crime, where old men share horror stories over cheap wine, they still talk about the Don who buried his brother alive. They talk about what came out when the door finally opened. Something that wasn't quite human anymore. Something that the darkness had changed in ways that shouldn't be possible. And on quiet nights, when the wind is right and old buildings settle into their foundations, people sometimes claim they can still hear it. A wet, guttural sound somewhere between a word and an animal's groan. The voice of a man who spent 12 years in absolute darkness and emerged as something else entirely. The creature in the bunker is gone. But the story remains, a reminder of what happens when shame becomes cruelty, when family loyalty is betrayed, and when a man is pushed so far beyond the boundaries of human existence that he becomes a legend whispered in shadow. Silas Russo went into that bunker as a man. What came out wasn't human anymore. And maybe that was always the point. Maybe that was the real crime, not just the imprisonment, but the transformation. The theft of humanity itself, one day at a time, scratch by scratch on concrete walls, in darkness so complete that even the soul couldn't find its way home. In 2023, during the demolition of an old shopping mall in Newark, construction workers broke through a section of concrete in the sub-basement and discovered a chamber that shouldn't have existed. The walls were covered in scratches that forensic analysts determined were made by human hands over a period of many years. Carbon dating of organic material found in the space suggested it was sealed in the late 1940s. The words scratched into the walls were mostly illegible, worn away by time and moisture. But one phrase remained clear enough to photograph, clear enough to set off a minor investigation that went nowhere because everyone involved was long dead. I did not want to die. The chamber was filled with concrete again. The construction continued. The mall was replaced with luxury condominiums where young professionals pay $3,000 a month for river views and hardwood floors, never knowing what lies beneath their feet. But sometimes, residents in the building's lower units report strange sounds at night. A scratching, they say, like fingernails on concrete, and a wet, guttural groan that seems to come from the walls themselves. The building manager assures them it's just the pipes, just the building settling, just the city, with all its history buried deep. But late at night, when sleep won't come and the darkness feels alive with possibility, some of those residents wonder. They wonder about the history beneath their feet, about the secrets that are never quite buried deep enough, about what happens to a human soul when it's locked away from light and love and everything that makes us who we are. They wonder, but they don't investigate, because deep down, everyone knows there are some truths that are better left in darkness, some stories that shouldn't be uncovered, some horrors that, once seen, can never be unseen. The bunker is gone. Silas is gone. Vittorio is gone. But the darkness remains. It always remains. And in that darkness, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the sound of fingernails scratching concrete, marking time, counting days, refusing to be forgotten, one scratch at a time, one word at a time, one breath at a time, until the very last one.